When I pulled out the stopper and put my nose to the mouth of the jug, the strong whiskey fumes went right up my nostrils and made my eyes water. His eyes and his eyebrows and skinned-up hands and yellow fingernails and 2 broken-off teeth and the gray hair under his hat around his ears. The whiskey smell was Dad's smell. I never got close to him in my life that I didn't smell it. The night Eddie and Wart brought him in out of the smokehouse, they didn't even pull off his boots. Gid had to do it after he came. For a while I sat by the bale, just holding the jug. It was brown, that thick glass kind. The outside was dusty, but the dust hadn't got through the stopper. It hadn't even rotted much. If I had drunk the whiskey, it would have made my tongue numb in a second. Twice in my life Dad had made me drink whiskey, and it scalded my throat both times. The first time I was just a little girl, 3 or 4 years old, and Johnny and his dad came over. The men were drinking. I don't know why they did it, but they caught us kids and made us each take a swallow of whiskey out of a tin cup. We cried and then ran off down to the pig pen together, me and Johnny. That was the day we got to be friends. That night, Dad got me on his lap and teased me. "How'd you like that liquor?" he said. "You want a little more? You can have some if you want it." Mama had done gone to bed. I hugged his neck big so he wouldn't make me drink any more. The other time was years later, 3 or 4 years before he died. I had slipped off somewhere with Eddie while Dad was gone to Henrietta. Dad got back first, and when Eddie and me seen the wagon, we knew he'd be mad. Eddie wouldn't come in with me. He let me off at the barn. "Hell, he's your dad," he said. "You can handle him better than I can." But I couldn't, really. When I went in the kitchen and told Dad where I'd been, he grabbed me and like to whipped the pants off me with his razor strap. "When I leave you at home," he said, "I want to find you here when I come back." My feelings were hurt, and I hurt from the whipping, too, and wanted to go to bed. But Dad felt lonesome and sorry for himself, and he made me sit up till midnight, keeping him company. We sat at the kitchen table, and he poured me a big glass of straight whiskey and told me not to drink it too fast, and not to leave till I drank every drop of it. I vomited half the night. There was only one time in my life when I ever drank whiskey of my own accord, and that was the afternoon Eddie told me he wanted me to miscarry Jimmy. He didn't know I was pregnant by Gid, either. He thought it was by him. I cried and argued with him about it. "Shut up arguing," he said. "I told you before we started all this, I never intended to have no kids. All the time I was growing up, I had them little brothers and sisters of mine under my feet constantly, and I don't intend to fiddle with no more kids. They're just trouble. You should never have let it happen. If you don't get rid of it yourself, I'll take you to a man who'll get rid of it for you." "What kind of a man is that?" I said, "and how do you know about him?" "I done rung the bell a time or 2 before in my life," he said. "It cost me $50 both times, but that's a damn sight cheaper than raising a goddamn kid. If you're smart, though, you can save us that $50. Go horseback riding a lot." "No, I want to have him, Eddie," I said. "I won't have any more, but I want to have this one." I was crazy about Gid in those days. He was all I could think about. "I told you what you better do," he said, finishing his beans, "and you better do it if you don't want no operation, because I'll take you if I have to drag you. You can believe that, can't you?" I could believe it. Eddie was just like Dad when it came to doing what he made his mind up to do. The only way to stop either one of them was to be stronger than they were, and I never was that strong, at least not physically. Once in a while I could stop them another way. That afternoon I cried and cried. I could already feel Jimmy kick against my belly. Then I got one of Eddie's whiskey bottles and kept mixing it with water and drinking it till I guess I got drunk. My head felt like it had smoke in it, and everything in the house looked funny. I decided I would try to get Gid to run away with me, and if he wouldn't, I'd run away myself. I had $14 of Dad's money that Eddie had never found. I figured I would catch a train to Amarillo. That was where Gid and Johnny went when they ran away. I guess I was crazy. I changed clothes 3 or 4 times that afternoon, trying to decide what to wear to go see Gid, and I never had that many clothes. I changed into some twice. When Eddie came in, I just had on an old cotton slip and was down on my hands and knees fishing under the sink, trying to find a tow sack or something to use for a suitcase. I must have been drunk. I never knew Eddie was in the house till I felt his hips jammed against my behind and his hand around my middle, but I knew it was his hand. Nobody's hand behaved like Eddie's. "I'm glad I got me a wife that goes around half naked," he said. "That's the most exciting kind." I was crazy. I didn't even know what he was saying. "Eddie, have you seen a sack?" I said. "I need a good big sack." For a while he wouldn't even let me back out from under the sink. I couldn't even raise my head. "Sack my eye," he said. "You don't need no sack, sugar doll." And his hand gave me fits, and he got to wanting to kiss me. Then he let me out. I couldn't get it out of my head that I was leaving. I wouldn't even know he was kissing me till he would quit for a minute. I had to vomit a lot that day, too. When Eddie woke me up, he told me I could have the baby. "I learned something today," he said. "It's more fun wallowing around with you when you're pregnant. I never knew that before. I wonder why it is." I was feeling so bad the news didn't penetrate to me till later. "I guess it must be the tilt," he said. "The tilt's a lot better this way. I hope it keeps on improving. I like to have something to look forward to." I guess it did, because it was him wallowing that made me start with Jimmy when the time came. I never even tried to get him to quit. That wouldn't have worked with Eddie. The day the baby was born, he left and didn't come home for 3 months, and that meant that Gid could come every day or two. I was happy. And Eddie, liking the tilt so good, made things a lot easier when Johnny got me pregnant again 3 years later. Otherwise, Eddie would have either beat me to death or left me then and there, or both. If there was one thing Eddie never had much of, it was patience with me. And Dad never either. Smelling the whiskey made me think of things about Dad that I hadn't thought of in years. He always felt the worst when he was the nearest sober. I guess it just took whiskey to make life look good to him. One of the worst times I ever had with Dad in my life was the afternoon he told me and Richard about the facts of life. It was 4 or 5 years after Mama died. I was about 17. Except for one trip to town when I was a little girl, I'd never been farther away from home than the schoolhouse. Eddie wasn't even in the country then, and since we were all too big for school, I didn't see Gid or Johnny more than a few times a year. Once in a while, they would stop at the windmill for a drink of water. I'd never even thought of having a boyfriend. My brothers were the only boys I really knew. And it was the same way with the boys. None of them ever had a girlfriend till after they run away from home. Richard never, I'm sure. He only went to the schoolhouse 2 years. Me and Mary Margaret were the only girls he ever saw, and him and Mary Margaret fought like cats and dogs. One evening I was rolling the flour to cook the supper biscuits, and Dad came in and sat down at the table. It was March or April, and the sand had been blowing. Dad's hair was full of grit, and he sat at the table and scratched his head. He never said a word to me. I started to ask him if he wanted me to give him a haircut. I gave all the haircuts my family had as long as I had a family, except for one burr haircut Joe got when he was in high school. It made me mad because he snaked around so about it. But Dad didn't want one. He was in a strange kind of mood, and I didn't bother him. I was getting ready to grease the biscuit pan when Dad went to the back door and yelled at Richard. In a minute, Richard slouched in. "Just leave them biscuits a while," Dad said. "Come back here with Richard and me." They went off down the hall, and I wiped some grease off my thumb and followed them. They had gone into Daddy's bedroom, and it was the biggest mess in the world. Dad never even let me make the bed. "Shut the door," Dad said. He sat down on his bed and pushed back his hat. He sat there about 10 minutes just thinking, and I wanted to get back to my biscuits. "What did you want, Daddy?" I said. Me and Richard were just standing there, except Richard wasn't impatient. He never was. "I guess Richard's old enough for me to show him a few things," he said. Neither one of us had any idea what he was talking about. Finally, he grinned at Richard. "Take your pants off," Dad said. It didn't surprise Richard. I guess he thought he was going to get a whipping, was all. He took off his overalls. It had been cold, and he still had on his long johns. "My God, them's dirty underwear," Dad said. "Take them off, too." "Oh, it's cold," Richard said, but he started unbuttoning anyway. In those days, me and Richard and Mary Margaret all slept in the same bed. Just Shep got to sleep by himself, and I had seen Richard pee 1,000,000 times, so he never thought of being embarrassed just because of me. I was just a little bit embarrassed. Not so much that as worried, because Dad was acting so strange. Richard was cold-natured and got goosebumps all over his legs. "Now, Molly, get your clothes off a minute," Dad said. I'd been about to giggle at Richard's goosebumps, but that surprised me. "Why do I have to?" I said. I knew better than that. Dad looked at me for the first time since he'd come in. "The next time you ask me why, when I tell you to do something, you'll get a real tanning," he said. But he wasn't mad. He was just warning. "What all do you say take off?" I said. He was cutting himself some tobacco then. "Every stitch," he said. "I need to show Richard about women, and you're the only one around. Hurry up." That was the first time I ever felt funny being around a boy. I took my pants and shirt off, but I sure did want to keep my underwear. "I'm cold, too," I said. "Ain't this enough, Daddy?" "I'm going to warm you in a minute," he said. "I told you what to take off." I still had on long johns, too, only the legs were cut out of mine. I went ahead and took them off and stood there naked, holding my underwear in front of me. Dad never looked at me, but I felt awfully embarrassed. It was a strange feeling. Then Dad noticed I was holding my underwear, and he snatched it out of my hands and threw it down on the floor. That made it worse. "All right now, Richard, looky there," Dad said, nodding at me. "That's how they look." Then he looked me up and down himself, a real long look. "Molly's a real pretty gal," he said. "You're lucky to get to see such a pretty one. She's a damn sight prettier than her mama ever was." "What am I supposed to look at?" Richard said. "All I see is Molly, and I know her anyway." If it had been anybody but Richard, I would have been even worse embarrassed. There wasn't no harm to Richard. Dad laughed. "You ain't looking good," he said. "Come up here by her and squat down where you can see. See where that hair's growing on her?" I didn't know what to do with my hands. I knew Dad didn't want me to cover myself up with them. Finally, I held them behind me. Richard had squatted down by me and was really looking. "Oh, yeah, that's where she pees," he said. "I see that. Why's all that hair grow there? It's on me, too, but not as much." "That's to make it hard to get into," Dad said. "The thing to remember about it is that's where you make babies, right up in that crack." "It don't look like a big enough place," Richard said. "I'm still cold without my pants." "Stand up here," Dad said. "You can just stay cold. You ain't much of a boy anyhow. Make him stiffen up, Molly, so I can tell him how it works." I knew what he meant, or I thought I did, and I didn't move. I didn't want to touch Richard. "Take a hold of him," Dad said. "He don't know the first thing." "No, I don't want to," I said. "Richard don't want me to either. He understands it. He's seen the bulls." "You're the contrariest damn girl I ever saw," Dad said. "Do like I told you." Richard was hanging there about arm's length away, but I knew I wasn't going to touch it, not even because Dad said to. In a minute I started to cry, and tears were running down my chest and stomach. "I'll give you something to cry about," Dad said, and stomped out. I knew he was going after the razor strap, and I couldn't think of anything to do. I just stood there crying. But the minute Dad left, Richard's got stiff. When Dad got back, it still was. Richard and me were both surprised. "Well, did she help you?" Dad said when he seen it. "No, it just done it by itself," Richard said. "I'm sorry, I never meant for it to." He was as embarrassed as me. "Why, hell," Dad said, "that's what I've been trying to get you to do." Now, you see, when it's like that, it fits the crack in Molly, and most of the time it makes a baby, so you got to be careful where you shove it. "You mean if you don't put it in, you don't have no babies? Then why do people have babies anyway?" Richard said. Richard had a hard time understanding it, but I did too. I just stood there wishing it was over. "Because it feels so good when it's up in there," Dad said. "You'll feel it someday." Richard perked up at that. He loved to feel good. "Oh," he said. "Then can I try it with Molly right now? I'd like to know just how it does feel." Dad hit him across the behind with the razor strap. "No. Get your pants on and get out of here," he said. "I've shown you all you need to see. You don't never do it with your sister, not never, and you better remember that." I reached to pick up my underwear, but Dad shoved me back away from it. "I'm going to have a little talk with you," he said, and Richard left. "Why didn't you do what I told you to?" he said. I tried to think of a good answer, but I couldn't. I didn't know why, actually. "I don't know, Daddy," I said. "Do you want me to whip you with this razor strap?" he said, standing up. I shook my head, but I knew he was going to. "If I brought that boy back and told you to do it again, would you mind me this time?" he asked. I thought about that a long time. From the way Dad looked, I knew about all I could do was take up for myself. Besides, I didn't want to touch Richard. "No, I wouldn't," I said. "I sure wouldn't." "I'll make you think wouldn't." he said, and I got the worst whipping he ever gave me. But I never did say I would, and he finally quit. He would always quit if I took up for myself long enough. Sometimes it was real hard to do, and it was hard then. Of course, Richard was a pest after that. Dad had got his curiosity aroused, and he soon forgot the part about not doing it with his sister. He pestered me for 2 solid years, but he wasn't no danger. He was just a nuisance. I could always fight Richard off. Dad always expected his kids to mind him without asking no questions, and whenever I got in trouble, it was always for not minding or for asking questions first. But I still thought he was an awful good daddy. And that's what Johnny and Gid could never understand. They never liked Dad. Neither did Eddie. But all they seen was his rough side. Dad never went around making over me, but I could tell he liked the way I fixed things and took care of him. He used to make me blue that I was the only one he had to love him. Mama and him wasn't suited for one another. Dad was rougher on her than he was on any of us. The boys all hated him because he worked them so hard, and Mary Margaret couldn't stand him. Him and Eddie did manage to tolerate one another, I guess, because they both liked to drink whiskey. Liquor was the only thing Dad ever gave away, mostly because he liked company when he drank. And Eddie liked free liquor. He took advantage of Dad that way. Once Dad even told me that if I got married, to marry Eddie. He ain't much count, he said, but at least, by God, he'll treat you like a wife ought to be treated. He won't pussyfoot around with you, I'll tell you that. That may have been part of the reason I married Eddie. We hadn't never been considered respectable, and he hadn't either. Eddie and Dad were a lot alike. They never tried to get ahead like most men do. They spent their time trying to enjoy themselves, and a lot of the time they were miserable anyway. All Eddie's folks were living in Arkansas, and he never had a soul to look after him or take up for him. I had liked Johnny ever since I knew him, but I never took marrying him serious. He wasn't the marrying kind, and we both knew it. So it was between Gid and Eddie. I liked Gid better, and there were times when I stayed upset for days trying to make up my mind to marry him. Sometimes I wanted to so bad I could taste it. But I thought Eddie needed a wife the worst. I was dead wrong about that. And then I thought I was too wild and bad ever to suit Gid. I was afraid if I married Gid, everything I did would disgust him, and I was dead wrong about that. I married Eddie, and everything I did disgusted him, and nothing I did ever made Gid stop caring for me. I'm more like Gid in the long run than I am like Dad or Eddie, but I was years and years finding that out. I wasn't just sorry for Eddie either. I was crazy about him sometimes. I was just crazy about him, about the way his hair was always shaggy and curly on the back of his neck. That may have been what I liked best about Eddie. It may have been why I married him, silly as that is. He never got a haircut, and I was always dying to put my hand on the back of his neck. But thinking about old times never got no loft cleaned out. I finally stoppered the bottle and got up, and then I pushed the sitting bale out the loft door so I wouldn't be tempted to sit down and daydream no more. It was 4:30 or so and cooling off, and by the time I got the west side of the loft raked, it was 6 or after, and milking time. I stood in the loft door and wiped the sweat off my neck and face with my shirt tail and watched the milk cow come up. When I got down, I hung the jug on a nail in the saddle shed, with the whiskey still in it. It was good and aged. There wasn't no use pouring it out. While I was milking, Johnny drove up in his pickup, and I talked him into staying for supper with me. He wasn't very hard to persuade. Chapter 4. I hadn't got a car till 1941. Besides being expensive and dangerous, I thought they was just plain ugly. I couldn't understand why so many people took such an interest in them. Both the boys were big car lovers, of course. The first $100 Jimmy ever made, he spent on an old rattletrap Hupmobile. He run it for 3 years and sold it to Joe for 50. From that time on, they were both on the road constantly, going somewhere. I just let them go. Them driving didn't worry me like me driving. They grew up in a time when cars were the thing, and they knew enough about them to handle them okay. After I had driven 2 years, I got so I could wrestle the car to town and back without any serious danger, unless the road was slick or I met somebody in a narrow place. Gid and Johnny had taken me to Wichita and advised me when I bought the car. It was a Ford, a black one. We looked at about 50, and it was the one Gid said I ought to get. I was enjoying the company, and I didn't care. Johnny was in a hilarious mood that day. "I wished you'd get that red convertible," he said. "A widow like you needs a car like that to haul her boyfriends in." "I wouldn't mind it," I said. "I think I'd like one open so I could climb out if I needed to." "You'd need to if I was with you," he said. We had stopped to drink coffee, and Johnny had drunk beer instead. It was old, watery cafe coffee, so I wished I'd drunk beer, too. I was feeling good that day. We all were. Gid was solemn as a judge, though, until we got the car bought. Spending that much money, even if it wasn't his, always made Gid sober. Just to tease him, I made them take me around to the Cadillac place, and I even got out and went in. They had the nicest salesman we met, too. I would just as soon bought one of his cars, but Gid rushed me off. "Phew, I'm glad to get out of there," he said. "He'd have sold you a limousine in another 10 minutes. "Well, I guess if I'd wanted it, I'd have bought it," I said. "It's my money, you know." "I know," he said, "but it won't be long." After we bought the Ford, he loosened up a lot, and we went to a big cafeteria and ate lunch. Johnny cut up with all the waitresses. It was a wonder they let us stay. Gid was just cutting up with me. "Well, we got that done. We can enjoy ourselves," he said. After dinner, they flipped a coin to see who would drive me home in the new car, and Gid won. Johnny didn't care. He took off in Gid's car, and I bet he went right to some beer joint and tanked up. Gid had on new boots and a new gray shirt that day, and he looked fine and handsome. He was just getting rich then. Anyway, he had a lot of confidence in himself. It was before Mabel made him move to town. "Well, since we're here," he said, "let's just make a holiday of it. You want to go to a picture show?" "I guess so," I said. "I'm just with you." So we went, and he bought some popcorn, and we sat right in the middle of the theater, and Gid put his arm on the seat behind me so that when I leaned back I could feel it against my shoulders and neck. It was such a comfortable feeling. And once in a while he would put his hand against my neck or my hair. Nobody else made me feel comfortable that way. I don't remember what the picture was or what it was about. I never can remember picture shows. Most of them are so silly anyway. When we came out of the dark show, the sun was so bright I could hardly see, and he had to practically lead me down the street to the car. It was a shiny, new-smelling car then. After I'd hauled chicken feed in it for a month or two, it smelled different. Gid drove, and we rode out of Wichita toward Scotland into the open country. I took off my neck scarf and unpinned my hair. The bobby pins were hurting my head. It was nice to get out in the country again. So far as I was concerned, Wichita Falls was the ugliest place on the earth. "Drives like a good car," Gid said, "just stiff. You bounce it over them old dirt roads a while and it'll get broke in." "It better be good," I said. "I intend for it to last me the rest of my life." My hair itched from being pinned up all morning, and I combed it out while Gid drove home. It was early fall. The boys had both volunteered in August, and they were still in boot camp. After that, Jimmy got sent to New Jersey and Joe to California, all the way across the country from one another. "Well, I guess the boys are doing okay," I said. "The worst thing they've complained about is the cooking." "Oh, have you heard from both of them?" Gid said. "No, just from Joe." We were past Scotland, over in the dairy farming country. I began to notice milk cows grazing in the pastures. But he said Jimmy didn't like the cooking either. Gid was looking blue. "Don't get depressed, honey," I said. "We've had such a good day. There's nothing we can do about him now." "Well, I wish we could think of something," he said. "I wish we could make it up to Jimmy some way, whatever we done wrong." Gid's little girl Sarah was 6 years old then, and Jimmy had been on his mind a lot longer than she had. She was a cute little girl, but you could sure see her mother in her. "You know we can't," I said. "We'd have to do over our whole lives. We just have to hope he'll outgrow hating us for it." "Oh, he don't hate us, I don't guess, does he?" Gid said. He couldn't stand to think that. I had lived with Jimmy and got so I could stand it long ago. "Oh, yes," I said, "he does. I'm just surprised he hasn't killed us." "Well, the Army might change him," he said. "He might be a little more tolerant when he comes back." I was looking at my comb. There were some hairs stuck in it, and the sun through the windshield was turning them golden. I was wondering how I would have been if I had been a blonde. Even worse, I guess. "It won't change Jimmy," I said, "any more than it would have changed you. We could have changed him if anybody could, and we didn't." I had begun to cry. He wanted me to scoot over by the wheel, but I wouldn't do it. I sat by the door till after we turned off on the dirt road. and all Gid could do was pat me on the knee with his hand and try to watch the road. When we got about a mile off the highway, out with the pastures on both sides of us and no cars anywhere, he stopped and pulled on the emergency brake. It squeaked, and it still squeaks, and took out his handkerchief and moved over by me and wiped my face. I took his hat off and laid it in the back seat. He done had some gray in his temples. "You oughtn't to cry," he said. His handkerchief was plumb damp. I took it and put it in my purse so I could wash and iron it for him. I looked out the window when he hugged me. I had my knees up in the seat, and he pulled back my skirt a little and rubbed his hand down the calf of my leg. "If it was Mabel, she'd have on stockings," was all he said. In a little while he drove on, and I scooted over by him and finished combing out my hair. It was such a pretty afternoon, so cool and sharp and clear. When we got home, I let Gid know I wanted him to come in with me, but he was ashamed from thinking about Jimmy and wouldn't do it. Gid's car was there, and Johnny's pickup was gone, so he had beat us home. "You don't have to go," I said. "Nobody will come." But he stood on the back porch and kissed me and wouldn't come in the house. It was me he was ashamed of some way. He wasn't very often, but when he was, it hurt me like a nail. "You can stay," I said. "I know I can," he said. "But, Molly, I better not." I turned and walked off from him into the cold house. One of the few times in my life I walked away from Gid like that. I guess he left. When I came out to milk, he was gone. It made me feel terrible because I knew he was mad at himself and in the awfulest misery, but there was nothing I could do about it but wait till he came to see me again. It was 2 months, 2 of the worst ones I ever spent, but he came back, and I made it up to him. Then for maybe 6 months he came every day or two. The night we got the car, though, Johnny came, and for once in his life he wished he'd stayed away. I was sick of myself and sick of everybody that night, and it was a lot more than Johnny could handle. I would wake him up and say terrible things to him. Finally, he got his clothes and left. In 3 or 4 days, I went over and found him and apologized, and it was all right. Who needed to have been there that night was Eddie. He would have really thought I was nasty if he could have spent that one with me. I would have run him off, too, or else he would have laid me out with a poker. Maybe that was what I tried to provoke Johnny into doing. Eddie might have done it. He wasn't scared of being mean. Of all the boys and men I loved, Jimmy was the one I completely lost. His eyes and the way he went about things was Gid to a T. Everybody knew it, and that made it worse. Eddie was dead before Jimmy got big enough for it to show, so it never bothered him. Actually, it didn't bother Gid too much. He was proud of Jimmy and couldn't help showing it. Mabel thought I was so trashy anyway, she was probably glad to have Jimmy and Joe for proof. But it broke Jimmy. He was too smart to try and fool. Maybe the boys made fun of him. He and Joe both had lots of fights. Joe never minded them. Jimmy did. Jimmy was crazy about me till he was 8 years old. Then he wasn't sure about me from then till he was 13. When he was 13, I told him Gid was his daddy. Then he was sure about me, and he hated me. He had been the most loving little boy. For 8 years I couldn't turn around without him being around my neck, and when the coin turned, he was just that hard a hater. When he was 10 or 11, his teachers at school started him going to church. There was a man teacher that liked Jimmy a lot. His name was Mr. Bracy, and for a long time he drove out every Sunday and got Jimmy and took him to church and Sunday school, and then brought him home. He never even asked to take Joe. It was always Jimmy, but Joe didn't care. He probably wasn't in a church 5 times his entire life. And in the long run, Mr. Bracy done Jimmy more good than harm. I never was mad at him, even after Jimmy told me what he done. I never told Gid about it. But it was the church people that really turned Jimmy into a hater. The more he took to religion, the more he turned against me. When I told him Gid was his daddy, he didn't bat an eye. We were sitting at the table. "I'm never going to call him Daddy, though," he said. "I didn't mean for you to. I just wanted to tell you." "I'm not ever going to call him anything," he said, and he didn't. Gid tried his best to get Jimmy friendly with him. He offered to take him cowboying and fishing and lots of places, but Jimmy wouldn't go. When he was real little, he idolized Gid, but after he found out Mr. Bracy was the only daddy he had. Jimmy was the only person I ever saw I couldn't have a little effect on. Even Dad I could help a little, and even Eddie. But I might have been a stone so far as Jimmy was concerned. He had friends, though. Him and Joe were always close brothers in spite of being so different, and Jimmy had plenty of other friends, too. He went out for all the teams, mostly just to keep from coming home and doing chores, but he made them all. They tell me he was an awful good player. The whole town bragged on him. He was twice as good as Joe. He went out, too, but he never took it seriously and was just medium. I never went to any of the games Jimmy was in because I knew he didn't want me to. I did see Joe play a few times. Jimmy and me only talked about things once. He had been off to a religious camp one summer, and they convinced him he was going to be a preacher. I didn't have much to say about it. I kept thinking about how much his granddaddy would have said. Gid didn't like it, but he never said a word about it. Johnny kidded Jim a little, but it was all right. Jimmy liked Johnny in spite of himself, and Johnny's kidding never made him mad. But one Sunday night, Jim come in from church. I guess he was 18 or 19 then. And I was sitting in the kitchen shelling peas. It was summertime, and I got up and fixed him a glass of iced tea. He tolerated me enough to drink it. I guess his resistance was down that night. He started asking me questions. "Have you ever been to church in your life?" he said. "I just want to know." "Oh, yes," I said. "I used to go to camp meetings." "Don't you like it in the Lord's house?" he said, looking at me through Gid's very eyes. I didn't know what to say except no, because I didn't really. He kind of looked down his nose. "The minister says I ought to bring you to church so he could try and save you," he said. "But I don't think I will. You wouldn't go anyway." I tried to grin, but it was hard. "No, I wouldn't go," I said. "Molly, you don't believe in salvation, do you?" he said. Once in a while he called me just by my name, I guess to hurt me. He didn't like to call me Mother, but I couldn't stand him calling me Molly as if he were just my friend. "Jimmy, if you can't call me Mother, don't call me anything," I said. "I mean that. Honor your father and mother. Ain't that in the Bible?" He didn't say a word, looked at the sugar in the bottom of his tea glass. His forelock fell down in his eyes, and I kept wanting to reach out with my hand and brush it back out of his face. "I don't guess I do believe in church salvation," I said. I went on snapping the little peas and shelling the big ones, and he sat across from me a long time without saying a word. When I looked up from my fingers, he looked me in the eye. He was like Gid. He always looked you in the eye when he hurt you. "You committed adultery and fornication," he said. "That's about as bad as a woman can get." When he said it, though, he sucked at the corner of his mouth and looked like a little boy trying not to cry. "You don't know how ashamed I am of you, Mama," he said. "I'm so ashamed of you I can't tell you." I let the peas alone. "You're telling me, Jim," I said. I would have given the best touches of my life to have been able to hold Jimmy then. I probably would have died right there if it would have taken what was bothering him away, but I knew nothing that easy would happen. He couldn't say any more, and I was choked up so I couldn't talk. We just sat. "Fornication and adultery is what you did, Mama," he said. I guess what he wanted was for me to deny it, to tell him I hadn't really done neither one, and that everything the preacher said about me was wrong. I sat the peas on the table. "Jimmy, those are just 2 words to me," I said, "even if they do come out of the Bible." "But you did them," he said. "In this house we're living in, too." "I wasn't saying I didn't," I said, "and I wasn't saying I'm good. I guess I'm terrible. But words is one thing and loving a man is another thing. That's all I can say about it." And that was true. The words didn't describe what I had lived with Gid or with Johnny at all. They didn't describe what we had felt, but Jimmy hadn't felt it, so I couldn't tell him that and make him understand. "There's such a thing as right and wrong," he said, like his daddy used to say. "I guess so," I said. He wanted me to argue, and I just couldn't. I felt too bad and worn out. I wanted to cry and never shed a tear. He finally got up and went to the door. "Yes, but there it is," he said. "And if you live unrighteous, you'll end up turning on a spit in hell." He sounded like a little hurt boy trying to convince himself. It was silly to think of turning on a spit the way I felt. I couldn't be seared no worse than I was. In a little while I went on and shelled the peas. Him and Joe left for boot camp about 2 weeks apart. Johnny and me took Joe to the train in Wichita, and I would have taken Jimmy, but he wouldn't let me. He hitchhiked, and he walked the 3 miles over to the highway, too. He wouldn't even let us take him that far. When he was out on the front porch ready to go, I gave him $20, but I didn't try to kiss him. He said goodbye and walked out of the yard and off across the pasture without ever looking back. Just before he went over the ridge, he shifted his suitcase to the other hand. I sent him a lot of cakes and cookies. He probably wouldn't like them, but maybe his buddies would. Chapter 5. When I started thinking about Jimmy, I always ended up thinking about Eddie. One morning out gathering the eggs, I got him on my mind. It was funny, and Jimmy never would have understood it. But if I really done them two things he accused me of, I'd done them with Eddie, and he was the one I was married to. I guess it really was the way the hair on the back of his neck was so shaggy that I liked best about him. A lot of times I felt completely crazy when I was around him, and I didn't care what I did. That's why he never liked me very well and was mean to me. He wanted somebody that acted real respectable to play like they was his wife while he went on and did what he pleased. But I guess it was a good thing I married him. I read in the paper about these sex fiends who are always killing people because they can't get enough woman, and it wouldn't have taken very much of a push to make Eddie one of those. In fact, when he would be after me 3 or 4 times a day, I thought he was one, and I told him so. It made him so mad he would almost choke me because he thought I was to blame. He thought I was always stirring him up on purpose. And I did once in a while, but not no 4 times a day. He didn't really like me very much. "You're a nasty bitch," he used to say. He said it so many times it finally quit bothering me. And the less I let things like that bother me, the meaner he got. Lots of times, when one of his hounds was in heat, he'd grab me and drag me out in the backyard and make me watch, while all the dogs fooled around with her. I soon quit fighting that, too. It didn't bother me that much to have to watch. I don't guess it really bothered me at all. "Looky there, sweetie," he said. "Why, she's just like you, ain't she? Just the same. What do you think about that sight?" I wouldn't answer or wouldn't say much. "It's just dogs breeding. It ain't too unusual," I said. Once in a while he would be fiddling around with me and make me mad. "Well, honey," I said one time, "I didn't know you liked to watch so much. I feel sorry for you. Let's go in and move the mirror over by the bed so you can watch us." I knew how to take up for myself where Eddie was concerned. What I said surprised him, but he couldn't back out. "All right, by God, let's do," he said. We went in and moved the mirror. I like to drove him crazy that day. Eddie had to feel that he was the most exciting man that ever went in me, and when I didn't let him feel that way, he squirmed. That day we moved the mirror, I lay there and laughed and giggled at him for 15 minutes, and I could have been a feather pillow for all the good he was doing. He knew it, too. Every time he looked in the mirror, I was grinning at him. I guess that was one of the times I hated him, because I had married him instead of Gid. That was the time he squeezed my hand so hard he broke my next to the littlest finger. "I'm tired of your goddamn laughing. Let's see you cry a little," he said, and squeezed it, but I wouldn't cry either. I just looked at him, and he got up and dressed and went to Oklahoma and was gone 6 weeks. About the time he came back, I got pregnant with Jimmy. Our times weren't always bad, though, mine and Eddie's. I was only mean to him 4 or 5 times when I couldn't help it. He would come in sometimes when I was washing dishes and grin at me and untie my apron and stand there behind me, fiddling with my hair or rubbing my neck or back or sides or front till I would finally turn around and kiss him and leave soap on his shirt. I never seen but one of his girlfriends. She was a redhead. She was at his funeral, and she came in with Eddie's sister, Laureen. Laureen didn't mind letting me know that the redhead was the girl Eddie ought to have married. They never brought Eddie home after he was killed. He was buried in Chickasha, Oklahoma, where Laureen lived. I went up there on a train. It was the longest trip I ever made in my life. It was right in February, cold and rainy. Eddie looked nice. I didn't think the redheaded girl was too pretty, and she didn't act very kind. I rode all night on the train back to Henrietta. It was a pretty sad trip for me. I kept seeing my face in the train windows. I couldn't see out at all. It was hard for me to believe Eddie was dead. I kept thinking I would feel his hands on me again. When I got off the train in Henrietta, it was after sunup, and Johnny and the boys were there waiting. I had left them with him, and they stayed in a little hotel. It was the first time the boys had ever been away from home. Johnny looked tired. I guess they had run him ragged, but I was so glad to see him. When they saw me, the boys were too timid to say anything, but Johnny came up and put his hand on my forehead. His hand was so cool. "Molly, you got fever, honey," he said. "You've worried yourself sick." "I sure don't like to travel," I said. I squatted down so the boys would see I wasn't mad at them, and they came and hugged my neck. Johnny bought them some donuts for breakfast. They hadn't ever had any before. Neither had I don't guess. While we ate, he fixed the tarp over the wagon. It was drizzling rain. We had plenty of quilts, and he fixed us a good pallet, and me and the boys curled up and slept nearly all the way home. The boys were just worn out from missing me. They didn't let me out of their sight for days. Just before we got home, I woke up and got on the seat with Johnny. He tried to make me wrap up, but the misty rain felt good. When we seen the house up on the hill, I cried till we got to it. That night I woke up in bed, and Johnny was asleep and snoring with his arm around me. I kept imagining Eddie, but it would never be Eddie again. I cried till the hairs on Johnny's arm were all wet, but he never did wake up. I had the eggs gathered and was changing the chickens' water when Gid and Johnny drove up in Gid's car. They never got out, but sat by the back gate with the motor running, watching me. I knew they wouldn't be staying no time, or they would already be out of the car and in the kitchen, so I went on and fixed the water. Gid was in a hurry somewhere, and Johnny had just managed to stall him a little while by coming by to say hello to me. "Boy, I'm sure having a scrumptious dinner today," I said, when I did get over to the car. Gid still had his gloves on and his hand on the steering wheel. "Well, I hope you've got a big appetite so you can eat it all," he said. "We've got 2 days' work to do before dinner time. How are you?" "Except for being short of company, I'm fine," I said. "You look awful prosperous today." "Hell, he is," Johnny said. "Who wouldn't be, hiring cheap help like me?" I walked around to his side. "That was dangerous," he said. "Didn't you know Gid had his foot on the foot feed? He might have run right over you." "I ain't that bad," Gid said. "I should have gone around behind," I said. "No, you should have climbed over. He's just as apt to back up as he is to go forward." They kidded with me a minute and said they would see me in a day or two, then they left. I got a little blue because I knew someday I would have to show Gid the letter from Jimmy. It would nearly kill him, but the war would be over someday, and there wasn't much hope of getting out of it. Gid never understood much about sex stuff, or at least I didn't think he did. Maybe I didn't understand it or was wrong about it. I guess we were just raised different. Except for that one time with Richard, Dad never mentioned it, and then he hadn't been talking to me anyway. Mama died when I was still pretty young, but she wouldn't have said anything about sex if I'd got up one morning with triplets. It just wasn't nothing Mama would have talked about.